The riddle had stood on the slate for 3 days. Hyo-eun-ha studied it the way she studied every problem that resisted her, not with frustration, but with the particular patience of a person who had learned that geometry eventually yields to anyone willing to wait it out. She stood with her arms folded, the chalk marks behind her, reading fire crossed out, lightning crossed out, and nothing written in the space below. When she finally spoke, her voice carried the careful neutrality of a woman confessing a limit. We have ruled out fire and ruled out lightning, and the engine still must be lit 1,000 times a minute. I confess I do not yet see the third door. She paused, and then her eyes moved to Do-jin, standing at the edge of the lamplight with his hands in his sleeves. But I have learned that when you go this quiet, it means you do, and you are afraid to hope it's real. Out with it. He had been quiet. He knew it. He had been quiet since the morning, turning the idea over the way a man turns a piece of steel to catch the light, looking for the flaw before he commits to the cut. The idea was old, older than the kingdom, older than the veil, older than any forge this frontier had ever run. He had been afraid to say it aloud, because saying it aloud would make it a plan, and a plan could fail. There's a third way to light a fire, Pyo. Older than flint, older than people. You don't bring the fire to the fuel at all. You make the fuel hot enough to light itself. He let that sit for a moment. And there's exactly one thing in this engine that already makes heat for free, every single stroke. The squeeze. The room was quiet for a beat. Then Cho Yeong began to rub her palms together, hard, fast, the way a child does on a cold morning, and held them up so the others could feel the warmth radiating off the skin. Squeezing air makes it hot, like that, but 1,000 times harder. Her voice was steady, working through it as she spoke, not reciting but discovering. So if we squeeze the air in the cylinder hard enough, it gets hot enough on its own to light the fuel, with nothing touching it. The match isn't a thing we add. The match is the squeeze we were already doing. She lowered her hands. We don't need to bring a fire. We make the air become one. That's the whole trick, Do-jin said. The engine lights itself with the heat of its own breath, held tight enough. My old world called an engine built this way, after a man's name. Here it'll just be the engine that needs no spark, which on a frontier with no lightning is the only kind worth building. Mok Jae had the fire piston in his hands before the explanation was half finished. He was like that, the kind of craftsman who needs to feel a principle before he can believe it, who trusts his palms more than his ears. The device was simple, a tube of dense hardwood, sealed at one end, with a close-fitted plunger and a small cup of tinder pressed into a recess at the bottom. He had made it himself that afternoon from Do-jin's sketch, working with the focused silence he always brought to small, precise things. He set the tinder, he positioned the plunger, he shoved it down, hard, fast, the full weight of his shoulders behind it, and pulled it back. The tinder was glowing. He stared at it. He turned the tube in the lamplight, and stared some more. He had not struck a spark. He had not held a flame near it. He had done nothing but push. I just shoved the plunger, and the tinder lit. His voice was somewhere between awe and accusation. Nothing touched it. I just squeezed the air, and the air lit the fire. He set the tube down on the bench and looked at Do-jin. A week ago a temple man would have burned me for this. Lighting fire from nothing but a hard push, that's a spell, except it's just air, crushed. How is the realist magic always just a thing nobody bothered to squeeze hard enough? Because it was never magic, Mok. It was always just physics waiting for someone to push hard enough to notice. Do-jin picked up the fire piston and turned it once in his hands before setting it back down. Now we make the engine do that 1,000 times a minute, on purpose. The cylinder is the tube, the piston is the plunger. Mok Jae looked at the tube for a long moment, then he picked it up and shoved the plunger again, just to watch the tinder catch a second time. The price arrived with Baek Dae-ho, as prices usually did. He had been listening from the doorway, arms crossed over his chest, the forge master's habit of letting other people finish before he told them what the work would actually cost. He came in now and stood at the bench and said what needed saying. To make the squeeze hot enough, you squeeze near 3 times harder than the steam engine ever did. He said it without drama, the way a man reads a measurement off a gauge. That's a cylinder that has to hold a pressure I can barely imagine, in walls thick enough and steel good enough that it doesn't split like a drop jar. He ran a thumb along the edge of the bench. This is the strongest single thing we've ever asked our steel to be. All those years of carbon and quench and grain, this cylinder is the exam. Do-jin nodded. He had known this was coming. He had been holding it alongside the idea for 3 days, the way you hold a counterweight. Then we proof-tested cold and far away first, twice over Pyo's worst number, Kwang's rule, Gil's rule. He looked at Taeho. This is the engine that asks everything of everyone at once. That's why it's the last thing we build. Taeho grunted. It was not agreement exactly, but it was acknowledgement, which from Taeho was close enough. Pyo-na returned to the slate. The timing problem was hers by nature, mathematics and linkage as she put it, her home country, and she had been working it since the moment Do-jin named the principle. She laid it out now with the precision she brought to every kinematic problem, her chalk moving in clean arcs. With no spark to time, the moment you inject is the moment it fires. She underlined the word inject twice. Inject a hair early and it fights the rising piston. A hair late and the heat has bled off and it will not catch. This little pump must drive a measured drop through a fine nozzle against a pressure that wants to blow the fuel right back out. At the exact peak of the squeeze, every stroke, forever. She set the chalk down. The timing I can give you, that is mathematics and linkage, my home country. But sealing a thumb-sized pump against that pressure, with no gasket that could survive it, that is hers. The room turned to Cho Yeong. Do-jin said it quietly. The plunger has to seal by nothing but how perfectly it fits its bore. A fit finer than anything we've ever needed, finer than Seo-rin can even measure. Seo-rin came the next morning with her light band gauges and her reference blocks and the flat calm she always carried into a measurement task, the composure of someone who has made her peace with the fact that the truth of a surface does not care whether you find it convenient. She measured the plunger, she measured the bore, she measured the gap between them in every orientation she could manage, working through her full kit with the methodical patience that had made her the frontier's standard bearer for 4 years. Then she set the instruments down. I cannot measure it, Cho. Her voice was level, not apologetic, just honest. My finest light bands lose the gap before it's tight enough. The fit this pump needs is below the floor of everything I can read. By my instruments, I can only tell you it's not right yet. After that, you're past where measurement can follow you. She looked at Cho Yeong directly. You're somewhere only your hands have ever been. Cho Yeong took the plunger from the bench. She held it the way she always held a piece she was about to learn. Not gripping it, just letting it rest in her palms, getting the weight and the temperature of it. Her expression was not quite reverence and not quite resolve. It was something between them, the look of a person arriving at the place they were made for. Below the floor again, she said softly. The bearing was here. A pause. This is the place I'm for. The place none of the measuring reaches, and somebody still has to know the truth of the fit. Give me the pieces. She closed her fingers around the plunger. And give me time. This one I have to do alone, and slow, and by feel. She worked for 2 days. The lapping compound was fine, finer than anything they had used before, mixed to Do-jin's specification, and then mixed finer still at Cho Yeong's request. She worked in the small room off the main workshop, the one with the single north-facing window that gave the most even light, though after the first few hours, she was working mostly with her eyes closed anyway. The motion was small and patient. The plunger into the bore, a careful rotation, a slow draw back, a pause, then again. She was not grinding. She was teaching 2 surfaces to become 1 surface, with a moving seam between them, removing material so fine it was closer to persuasion than cutting. The light bands had given up 3 sizes ago. There was no instrument left in the workshop that could tell her anything useful. There was only the steel, and what the steel told her fingers. She talked to it sometimes, not loudly, just the quiet murmur of a craftsman in conversation with a difficult piece. There, no, not yet. There's a whisper of slack on the downstroke. Right there, I can feel it breathe past. A hair more lapping, just there. She would stop, mix the compound a shade finer, begin again. The light bands gave up 3 sizes ago. It's only me and the steel now. And the steel doesn't lie to my fingers. It never has. Come on, come true for me. Become one thing with a seam. On the second afternoon, near the hour when the light through the north window went the color of old pine, she stopped moving. She held the plunger still in the bore for a long moment, her eyes closed, her breathing slow. I can feel exactly how far you've still got to go. If you can feel it move, you can feel when it moves true. She worked another hour. Then she set the plunger down on the cloth and opened her eyes. She brought it to Do-jin in the evening, carrying the 2 pieces in her hands with the careful steadiness of someone transporting something that has no replacement. She looked tired in the way that comes from sustained fine attention rather than physical labor, the particular exhaustion of 2 days spent reading a language that only she could hear. She set the plunger in his hand. It's true, it seals on nothing but the fit, 2 pieces made into one shape with a sliding seam, and nothing gets past, not even the fuel at full pressure. She met his eyes. I can't show you a number for it, Do-jin. There isn't one. There's just my word, and the fact that it doesn't leak. The orphan they threw in the river made the one part of this engine that no machine and no measure on earth could make. He tested it. He drew the plunger through the bore and felt the resistance, even, total, with no variation across the stroke. He turned it. He drew it again. He pressed the sealed end against his palm and pushed, and felt no air escape past the seam. He held a lamp to it, and looked for the glint of fuel seeping through, and found nothing, not a drop past it. He stood there for a moment with the assembly in his hands, and felt something he rarely let himself feel in the middle of a build, something close to awe, though he would not have used that word for it. 4 years ago I had you file 2 plates flat to teach you there was such a thing as true, he said. His voice was quiet. And you just made a fit finer than the finest measure we own, by hand, by feel, because the measure couldn't follow you there. He looked at her. You are the floor of the knowable now. The rest of us read instruments. You read the steel. Cho Yeong said nothing. She looked at the assembly in his hands for a moment, and then she looked away, out the window, at the failing dome of the Vale, pale against the evening sky. Assembly took the better part of the next morning. Pyo-eun-ha worked the injection linkage with the focused intensity she brought to any problem of timing and ratio, adjusting the cam relationship in increments so small that Do-jin had to watch the chalk marks on the flywheel to track them. Mok Jae fitted the cylinder and checked every joint. Taeho stood back and watched the steel he had made take its place in the machine, saying nothing, his arms at his sides. They ran the first trial by hand, turning the flywheel through the compression stroke to feel the resistance, enormous, the cylinder walls holding against a pressure 3 times what the steam engine had ever asked of them. The steel held. Taeho's exam passed. Then they ran it for real. The first stroke fired and died. The second fired and died. Pyo-eun-ha listened to the knock, the hard, wrong sound of combustion fighting the rising piston, and reached for the linkage. Too early still. Hear it knock back against the squeeze? It is firing before the piston is ready and beating itself. She adjusted. A hair later. We are inside the last hair now. Everything is right except the one instant, and the one instant is everything. Only the engine can tell us when the hair is right, by firing and not dying. They ran it again. Mok Jae was counting under his breath. He stopped counting and looked up. 3 strokes that time. 3 real bangs on her own. No belt pushing her. She's trying to live, teacher. She keeps almost catching. She wants to run. 1 more hair. Pyo-eun-ha's hand was already on the linkage. They stopped for the evening with the engine still not running continuously, but running in bursts. 3 strokes, 4 strokes, the combustion catching and sustaining, and then losing itself, like a fire in wet wood that keeps almost taking. It was not failure. It was the last hair. Do-jin knew the difference. Cho Yeong stood beside him looking at the engine on its stand, and said what she had been thinking since the morning. It doesn't need a spark. It doesn't need the magic. It makes its own fire out of nothing but how hard it can squeeze. She was quiet for a moment. It's like us, isn't it, Do-jin? The whole frontier. Nobody's coming to light our fire. So we learn to squeeze hard enough to make our own. He looked at the engine, at the cylinder Taeho's steel had made, at the plunger Cho Yeong's hands had fitted beyond the reach of any instrument, at the linkage Pyo Eun-ha had calculated to the last hair of timing, at the fire piston on the bench where Mok Jae had left it, tinder still in its cup. That's exactly what it is, Cho. An engine for a people the gods walked out on. It makes its own fire and asks no one's leave. He turned the thought over once more, feeling for the flaw, and found none. Lit by crushed air and sealed by your hands, there's not a borrowed thing in it anywhere. It's the most free machine I've ever helped build. He stayed after the others left. He stood at the slate and struck off the two walls that had stood there for 3 days, fire and lightning, both crossed out, both solved. The chalk marks came off clean. The slate was bare. 3 strokes. She had given them 3 real strokes on her own, no belt driving her, no hand on the flywheel. 3 strokes, and then the timing had slipped, and she had gone quiet again, but the strokes had been real. He had heard them. Everyone in the room had heard them. The little fire had tried to live. He looked at the engine on its stand in the lamplight, the cylinder walls thick with Taeho's best steel, the plunger seated in its bore with a fit that existed below the floor of the knowable. Everything they had learned in 4 years was bolted to that stand. Every plate scraped flat, every lathe screw cut, every bearing lapped, every standard set and certified and built upon, all of it had been in service of this moment, this machine, this morning that was almost here. Tomorrow they would find the last hair. Pio would move the linkage one more increment, and they would run it again, and either the timing would find the one instant that was everything, or it would not. He picked up the chalk and wrote nothing. There was nothing left to write. "Run for me tomorrow, little fire," he said to the engine quietly, the way a man speaks to something he has built and cannot control and cannot stop hoping for. "Please, just run." The lamp burned low. The veil outside the window held its pale light against the dark, thinner than it had been last season, thinner than it had been last month. The dome of borrowed time that had always been the reason for all of it. He did not look at it. He looked at the engine. 4 years, one more hair, one more morning.